The sky tore open above him, and Lieutenant Werner Steiner's hands froze on the control stick of his Messerschmitt as something massive blotted out the sun. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. An aircraft, impossibly large, falling from directly overhead in what looked less like a dive and more like a controlled meteorite strike, its nose pointed almost straight down, its engine screaming with a sound that seemed to contain all the fury of gravity itself. Steiner yanked the stick hard right, his body crushing against the cockpit wall as the Bf-109 snapped into a turn, but the American fighter was already adjusting, already following, already committed to a trajectory that made Steiner's evasive maneuver look like the desperate flailing of prey that had just realized it was being hunted by something far larger and far more terrible than anything it had evolved to escape. The sound was what paralyzed him, that howling shriek of a massive radial engine at full throttle, combined with the whistle of air being torn apart by a 7-ton aircraft moving faster than anything that heavy had any right to move. And in that moment, Werner understood with absolute clarity that he was about to die. 3 months earlier, during the briefing at Yevva Airfield, the intelligence officer had spoken about the new American fighter with a tone that tried for dismissiveness but couldn't quite hide the underlying concern. The P-47, they were told, was a monster, the Americans' typical solution to every problem, which was to build something bigger and heavier and more powerful than necessary. It was huge, they said, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt, powered by an enormous radial engine that made it look like a flying barrel. The Luftwaffe pilots had laughed, had made jokes about American excess, about how the Yankees thought throwing metal and horsepower at a problem was the same as engineering elegance. German fighters were sleek, refined, the products of sophisticated aeronautical science and combat experience dating back to Spain and Poland. The Bf-109 was a rapier, quick and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. The FW-190 was a broadsword, powerful and aggressive. Both had been designed by men who understood aerial combat, who knew that agility and climb rate and roll authority were what mattered in dogfights. The P-47, they were assured, would be easy prey, too heavy to turn, too sluggish to compete with German fighters in the knife fights that developed over the Reich. Let the Americans bring their oversized truck into combat. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots would make short work of it, but no one had adequately explained what that weight meant when it was falling from above, when gravity became an ally instead of an enemy, when mass and momentum combined with a powerful engine to create something that didn't fly so much as plummet with terrifying precision. Steiner had been cruising at 4,000 meters, his flight of 4 Messerschmitts covering a bomber formation heading back from a raid on Allied positions in France, when the call came over the radio, "Achtung, Thunderbolts above." He had looked up reflexively, had seen them perhaps 2,000 meters higher, had felt a moment of satisfaction that the Americans had made the tactical error of engaging from altitude where German fighters could use their superior climb rate to gain advantage. Then the P-47s had rolled over and dived, and everything Steiner thought he understood about aerial combat had shattered like glass under a hammer. The American fighter wasn't diving the way German fighters dived, in a controlled descent that maintained some margin for maneuvering and recovery. It was diving like a stone, like something that had lost its wings and was simply falling with style, the angle so steep that Steiner's mind kept insisting it had to be out of control, had to be a pilot who had been hit and was going down, except the nose kept tracking, kept adjusting, kept pointing directly at him with a precision that spoke to absolute mastery of the aircraft. The air scream was building, becoming a banshee wail that Steiner could hear even through his leather helmet and over the roar of his own engine. His altimeter was unwinding rapidly as he threw the Messerschmitt into a dive of his own, trying to use speed to escape, but the American was faster, impossibly, physics-defyingly faster, as if the P-47's weight was an advantage rather than a handicap, as if it had been designed specifically for this kind of attack. The first burst came when the range closed to perhaps 200 meters, and Steiner felt the impacts before he heard them, felt his aircraft shudder as rounds stitched across the left wing, tearing through aluminum and severing control cables. The sound followed a microsecond later, not the crisp ripping of 20mm cannon fire that German pilots were used to, but something heavier, meatier, like a giant tearing sheet metal with his bare hands. 8 50 caliber machine guns, he remembered from the briefing, 8 of them synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, 8 streams of heavy bullets converging on whatever the American pointed his nose at. The P-47 flashed past him so close that Steiner could see the pilot's face, could see the oxygen mask and the tinted goggles and the absolute concentration of someone who was completely confident in what they were doing, and then it was gone, pulling out of the dive with a violence that should have torn the wings off but didn't, climbing away with power that made Steiner's Daimler-Benz engine look like a toy. His left wing was trailing smoke, the aileron response was mushy, and Steiner knew he had seconds before the structural damage became catastrophic. He rolled right, trying to compensate for the wounded wing, trying to maintain altitude, but his eyes kept tracking back to where the P-47 had disappeared into the sun, waiting for it to come back, waiting for that terrible dive to start again. Around him, the radio was chaos, German pilots calling out contacts, calling for help, warning each other about the Americans diving from above like hawks on field mice. One voice was screaming something about his engine being hit, another was cursing steadily in a monotone that suggested shock, a third simply went silent mid-transmission in a way that needed no interpretation. The bomber formation was breaking apart, the careful geometry of the defensive box dissolving as pilots tried to evade attackers they couldn't see until it was too late. Steiner managed to level off at 3,000 meters, nursing his damaged fighter, watching his oil pressure gauge begin to fluctuate in a way that suggested the P-47's guns had done more damage than he initially thought. The sky above him was empty, the Americans having apparently dived through the formation and then disengaged rather than trying to dogfight at lower altitudes. It was a smart tactic, Steiner realized, one that played to the P-47's strengths and avoided its weaknesses. Why try to turn with a Messerschmitt when you could climb back to altitude on that massive engine and simply dive again? The German fighters couldn't follow them up there, couldn't maintain the energy to climb and fight simultaneously, couldn't do anything except wait for the next attack to come screaming out of the sun. It was psychological warfare as much as aerial combat, the terror of knowing that at any moment that terrible diving attack could begin again, that there was no safe altitude, no secure formation, nowhere to hide from an enemy that could choose the moment and manner of engagement. The flight back to Yevva was the longest 20 minutes of Steiner's life. His Messerschmitt was dying underneath him, the engine temperature climbing steadily, the controls getting progressively more sluggish as hydraulic fluid leaked from damaged lines. He kept his head on a swivel, kept scanning the sky above him, kept waiting for the shadow that would mean death was diving at him again. 2 of his flight hadn't made it. One had been blown apart in the initial pass, his aircraft disintegrating under the concentrated fire of 8 heavy machine guns. The other had managed to bail out after his engine caught fire, though whether he had survived the parachute descent over occupied France was unknown. Steiner and his wingman were the survivors, limping home with damaged aircraft and shattered confidence. The Americans had made it look easy, had turned experienced Luftwaffe pilots into panicked targets with a tactic that was as simple as it was devastating. Climb high, dive fast, hit hard, escape before the enemy could react. The technical briefing that followed, once Steiner had managed to land his crippled fighter and been debriefed by squadron intelligence, was sobering in ways that the pre-combat briefing had not been. The P-47, they now understood, was optimized for exactly the kind of attack Steiner had experienced. Its massive weight, which had seemed like a disadvantage, meant it could dive faster and steeper than lighter German fighters without breaking up. Its powerful engine meant it could climb back to altitude quickly after the attack. Its rugged construction meant it could absorb damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt and keep flying. And its 850 caliber machine guns, while lighter than the 20mm cannons German fighters carried, fired at such a high rate that they delivered comparable destructive power at range. The Americans had built a fighter that excelled at boom and zoom tactics, at vertical attacks that German fighters couldn't counter because the angles and speeds involved were simply beyond what Bf-109s and Fw-190s had been designed to handle. Word spread through the Luftwaffe squadrons in France and the Low Countries like a virus, carried by surviving pilots who described encounters with the big American fighters in terms that mixed technical analysis with barely suppressed fear. The P-47s hunted from altitude, they said, always positioned above the German formations, always patient, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They didn't dogfight unless they had no choice. They dived, fired, and climbed away before German pilots could react. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who had been confident, even cocky, began hesitating before missions, began spending more time scanning the sky above them than watching their instruments, began developing a constant low-level anxiety about what might be lurking in the sun at 10,000 meters. The Americans had found a tactical solution that negated German advantages in training and experience. You couldn't dogfight an enemy who refused to dogfight, couldn't use superior turning ability against an attacker who struck from angles where turning was impossible, couldn't leverage combat experience when the engagement lasted seconds and was over before you could react. Steiner flew 7 more missions over the next 2 weeks, and each one followed the same pattern. The American fighters would appear high above, looking like distant insects against the blue, and German pilots would know what was coming but be powerless to prevent it. They tried spreading out, creating formations that made diving attacks more difficult, but the P-47s simply singled out individuals and destroyed them methodically. They tried flying at maximum altitude themselves, but the Americans climbed higher, always maintaining the vertical advantage that made their tactics so effective. They tried timing evasive maneuvers to the moment of attack, but the P-47s adjusted so quickly that the maneuvers just made them easier targets, presenting their planforms to the diving fighters like target silhouettes at a gunnery range. Nothing worked. The Americans had found a solution to German air superiority, and it was simple. Use physics instead of finesse, use weight and speed instead of agility, use altitude and patience instead of aggressive maneuvering. The sound became the worst part, worse even than the bullets or the casualties or the constant fear. That howling scream of a P-47 in a vertical dive got inside pilots' heads, became a trigger that could make even experienced veterans flinch and break formation at the first hint of the noise. It was the audio signature of helplessness, of being hunted by something that you couldn't outrun or outfight, of facing an enemy who had figured out how to turn your own skills and training into irrelevance. German pilots started having nightmares about it, started hearing it in ambient sounds, wind through hangar doors, the whistle of bombs falling during Allied raids, even the sound of their own engines at certain RPM ranges. The psychological warfare was unintentional, but devastatingly effective. The P-47 didn't have to be present to affect German pilot performance. The memory of it, the anticipation of it, was enough to degrade combat effectiveness and create hesitation at moments when decisiveness was crucial. By the 3rd week, Steiner's squadron had lost half its strength. Some pilots were dead, blown apart by those terrible diving attacks. Some had been wounded, their aircraft damaged badly enough that they crashed on landing or didn't make it home at all. Some had simply broken, had developed mysterious ailments or behavioral problems that made them unsuitable for combat duty, their minds having decided that survival required removal from a situation where death came screaming out of the sky without warning. The replacements who arrived to fill the gaps were younger, less experienced, trained in a Luftwaffe that no longer had the resources or time to produce the kind of veteran pilots who had dominated the skies in the war's early years. They listened to the survivors describe the P-47 attacks with wide eyes and pale faces, and Steiner could see them processing the information, could see the fear taking root before they had even encountered the enemy. The Americans were winning a psychological victory that went beyond simple attrition, were creating a situation where German pilots were defeated in their own minds before the first shot was fired. Steiner's last flight came on a grey morning in early June, when his flight was tasked with intercepting American bombers returning from a raid on rail yards near Paris. They found the bombers at 4,000 meters, a box formation of B-17s surrounded by escort fighters that included at least a dozen P-47s circling high above like patient predators. Steiner knew what would happen next, knew it with the certainty of experience and the dread of repeated trauma. The American fighters would wait until the German interceptors committed to attacking the bombers, would wait until the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were low and slow and focused on their targets, and then they would dive, and there would be nothing anyone could do except die or run. He chose to run. When the first P-47 rolled over into its attack dive, when that familiar banshee scream began to build, Steiner simply pushed his stick forward and dived away, abandoning his wingman, abandoning the mission, abandoning any pretense of courage or duty in favor of the base animal instinct to survive. He heard his squadron leader screaming over the radio, heard the shame and fury in the man's voice, but he didn't care because behind him he could hear the sound of 8 50 caliber machine guns tearing aircraft apart, could hear the brief cut-off screams of pilots who had stayed in formation and paid the price. Steiner kept diving until his altimeter showed 500 meters, kept the throttle firewalled until his engine was redlining, kept running until the sounds of combat faded behind him, and he was alone in the sky with nothing but the knowledge of what he had become. He landed at a different airfield, claimed mechanical problems, and spent 3 days in a field hospital being treated for combat exhaustion. When he was released, his squadron had been dissolved, the survivors folded into other units, his personal belongings shipped to some rear area assignment where pilots who couldn't fight anymore were warehoused until the war ground them up in some other fashion. He never flew combat again, never faced the P-47s again, never had to hear that terrible diving scream again. But he heard it anyway, in his dreams and in his memories, heard it for the rest of his life, whenever he looked up at the sky and saw contrails high overhead. The sound of American power and German impotence, the sound of a tactical revolution that had made his training and experience meaningless, the sound of death choosing its moment and diving with the weight of inevitability and the precision of industrial killing. The P-47 had taught Werner Steiner something that Luftwaffe instructors could never admit, that courage and skill meant nothing against an enemy who could dictate the terms of engagement, who could attack from angles that made defense impossible, who could combine weight and speed and firepower into a combination that broke both aircraft and mines. Years after the war, when he was an old man teaching school children in Hamburg, he would sometimes see military jets overhead, would watch them climb to altitudes where they looked like tiny silver crosses against the blue, and he would feel his hands begin to shake with the remembered terror of looking up and seeing death beginning its dive. The sound would come back to him then, that howling scream of a 7-ton fighter falling from the sky with all the mass and velocity and inevitability of an avalanche, and he would remember what it felt like to be helpless, to be hunted, to understand that the only choice was between dying like a hero or surviving like a coward, and that survival meant accepting the shame of running from an enemy who had learned to weaponize gravity itself against men who had thought mastery of the air meant mastery of combat, only to discover too late that the sky had a vertical dimension they had never truly understood, until the Americans taught it to them, one screaming dive at a time.